Our ancestors were living in crude villages with virtually no technology, and suddenly alien technology and systems were introduced by invading gods. It's in the book many, many places. The lazy, sleepy days for Homo sapien were at an end. And as they bred with the alien gods, their brain circuits were evidently changed. Our ancestors no longer dwelled in the Edenic paradise like innocent children. They ate of the fruit of knowledge and had to start making choices and learning to handle the newly introduced technologies and knowledges. And instead of the instinct like the animals had, they had to choose between ethical and non-ethical actions. The problem arose because of the reflection knowledge introduced by the gods according to the Hermetic works. The gods carried the exact opposite systems of intelligence that the Creator had as his system. And instead of choice laws, which allowed all beings of intelligence choice, the gods were exiled to Earth for ignoring choice and starting domination systems here. Traditions and legends tell of an emissary called the Windy One, translated Holy Ghost, who visited the early rebel gods, and he told them to stop their dominion of innocent tribal people or to suffer the consequences. And as the early gods and rulers refused, they lost their immortality and had to be born of babies, like the species that they had been subjugating. This is the legend. With such corrupt souls taking on the bodies of mortals, it should be obvious why such chaos continues on our planet. There are powerful, power-mad entities with superior knowledge of technology and domination tactics taking on human bodies constantly here. And with their inner soul tapes carrying over this ability to manipulate and control, such beings take over government and business leadership positions with ease. They have a natural ability at domination and of using others. And since money is the most useful tool toward gaining power, they have no compunction at using others as workers to amass their wealth. Because of their background, few of these ancient exile souls have any of the usual ethics to hinder their material progress here. According to a number of spiritual teachers, there's a problem coming up for them, however. There's a time limit on re-entry into the Creator's choice system. And at the time of the end, which is coming up at the turn of the century, all humanity must choose their future according to some of these avatars. And the scenario is quite simple. We humans have had 10,000 years of exposure to both choice and domination systems, and now we must make a choice as to which one we is to live by and to follow. And what happens to persons who make no choice or follow domination is very simple. They simply used the various new mind components that they were contaminated with at the time our species mated with these gods. The meek shall inherit the earth. Well, what do we mean by meek? Well, in simplistic terms, this means a return to animal instinct. The fruit of knowledge will be stripped away again, and the simple life will return once more to earth. Those that wish to carry on in higher knowledges with intelligence can do so under ethical self-control. And those who want to go back to the simple life and escape the responsibilities of self-control can do also. A soul-led being will choose, and the choice will determine the being's status for an eternity, according to some of the avatars. Well, the world's Bibles put all of this in more simplistic, veiled terms, but the basics were there. All Bibles have been filled with the doctrines of choice and ethics, and the doctrines of fear and domination. Either humans feel domination is necessary in the world, or we feel that ethical self-control and free choice are necessary. And we will all make the choice, knowingly or unknowingly. And it is necessary under choice laws of the universe that we make this choice. And in our production of Earth Report, there are further details on this outline. But in our journey through recent history, this background is enough here. It will help to explain why there are thousands of humans who are trying to bring about socialism and a one-world government. These leaders are often carrying components that drive them from their reflection point of view. A point of view where they feel that they are superior and need to rule over the childish majority here. To them and their leaders, humanity will never have enough self-control and ethics to make a reasonably stable civilization here. They actually feel that their superior intellect and abilities are needed to govern the rest of the world's people. And if their tactics are ruthless, well, so what? The souls will find new bodies later. Nothing's really lost in the long run. But what the advocates of domination seldom notice is that this system is self-destructing. The highest leaders have good intentions, like a paradise on earth as a goal, but their systems just can't seem to handle the construction. Look at history if you doubt this. Thousands of little tyrants come along on their own, and they only want their own kingdoms and power. The higher level domination leaders simply can't control all these little ambitious underlings. Yes, you can look up this erosion principle in history books on your own. A good place to start is Rousseau's monumental Freedom and Domination. This is a classic in the field, and it shows how all governments and systems of the past self-destructed as their choice principles eroded away. Citizens who embraced socialism and wanted something for nothing invariably gave up their freedoms, and their end usually came quickly, according to history. Well, the elite rulers work through governments because people easily follow governments, and the governments can usually be manipulated and controlled by the elite. And the founding fathers of the United States did their best to set up a constitution that was invulnerable to the ruling elite. And they knew what a government gave, it could also take away. And they set up the system so that all laws which were unconstitutional were invalid. And today, hundreds of thousands of laws are unconstitutional, but they are not contested and overruled by the indifferent citizens. Well, William Penn wrote that if we weren't governed by God, then we would be governed by tyrants. That's quite a true statement. Virtually all of our founding fathers wanted rights of the individual over the rights of the state. And they were restrictive toward government rights, not the rights of the individual. They also knew that property was important. Governments that could control property could control the individual. And as socialistic governments set up taxation, licenses, and permits and such restrictions quickly eroded away freedoms. And production in socialistic and communistic countries stagnates when private ownership and sales rights are stripped. The tiny private plots of farmers in Russia and China were supplying about half the food in the mid-'80s, even though there was 5 times the land on collective farms of the state. Choice factors have always proven superior to the peoples of the world. Only leaders constantly brainwash and coerce people into domination systems, and it's usually for their own gain and power. And of course this leads to an early death of any system or structure. And to see how all of recent history has been corrupted by domination leaders, let's look at events after the time of the Byzantine Empire in Europe. This huge empire lasted 1,200 years and was the last successful empire to remain free of the elite and their hidden control. After this time, the church and state never worked together peacefully again. The rulers found that they could rule through their monetary systems if they kept many small factions quarreling and fighting among themselves. And if they could control from behind the scenes without any attention or discovery under such conditions, they could live just like the old gods of legend. And one of the world's great ruling structures today is the Rothschild Group. And they started from a banker named Amschel, who financed King George mercenaries during the war against our first patriots. And today his descendants make up our Federal Reserve System and rule much of our world today.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
came for the 1917 Communist Revolution. The Rothschilds wanted the billion-dollar fortunes of the Tsars or the Romanov rulers of Russia. And once this fortune was seized and safely in the Rothschild banks across the world, the more or less ethical Romanov lineage was replaced by the completely unethical black nobility lineage now ruling the world from Europe. The black nobility quickly gained their power by unscrupulous methods all across the globe, and they stripped Germany of her through World War I. Later, Hitler came along and promised to give the depressed and conquered Germany back to the German people. And he actually did this for a short time. But unfortunately, he was double-crossed. The Federal Reserve banking money from New York that helped finance him at first was cut off later, and he was told that England would support his actions, and we know that later, of course, England and the bankers cut him off and turned against him. Well, since the European bankers gained financial control of America through this Federal Reserve system that we have, their puppets like Roosevelt saw to it that the U.S. got involved in the war against Germany also. The bankers wanted Russia and her people strong enough to play against the West, so they saw to it that Russia gained the most from a demolished Germany. Russia gained a vast empire from World War II, and many others hidden things that Americans have never learned about. For example, she got the plates to print all of the new German occupation money that she needed, and the American taxpayers got bled for the entire communist takeover. And the elite's frontman, Eisenhower, was sent to ensure that the Berlin Wall was put and kept in place. When Patton, the war hero, came along and had objection, of course, he was simply liquidated. And if you doubt this, the records are easy enough to show the facts, and there are books out on it. And later wars, of course, have usually been the inventions of the elite as well. Ho Chi Minh, for example, was under a Rothschild agent, Donovan, prior to his being put in power as a frontman leader. The bankers made huge profits when they suddenly declared war on their own leader in Vietnam. And the famed leader, General MacArthur, who was so effective in World War II, was told to back off, and was even fired when he got too serious about ending the war in Korea. Well, earlier wars had similar foundations. The Boer War in South Africa let the Rothschild interests, or De Beers, take over most of the huge gold and diamond interests there. Even our own Civil War resulted when the banking interests of the North saw an easy chance to reap easy wealth from the South. There was nothing unconstitutional about the South seceding in the first place, and the carpetbaggers the bankers later sent to the captured South largely held power, and much of the wealth there is held in their hands even to this day. Most of the governments of the West, including Russia, are kept in line and ruled by the banking elite's chosen leaders. Nikita Khrushchev was a Russian leader that was quickly ousted when he wanted more authority and wished to aid his nation's farmers at the time. You might remember that Rockefeller met with him and got him back on track, and then saw to it that Russia stayed dependent on U.S. wheat. And there, the Rockefeller brokering monopoly in this country. Well, Americans are ruled today through the programs set up by the bankers' powerful foundations, like the Brookings and Hoover Institutes. And all this got started after the Civil War, when the Peabody Foundation was set up and found to be an ideal way to let the South get taken over by outside interests legally. And such foundations find legal loopholes to circumvent the Constitution and allow the Council of States programs to erode away our rights. And today we're actually run through a carefully disguised form of martial law. The socialistic factions, or Fabians, rule through the elite's frontmen coming from places like Harvard and the University of Chicago. And these universities furnish most of our financial leaders now. And they are, in turn, ruled by the elite's faceless leaders, like Guy D. Rothschild and Toxis, Harriman, Russa. And few of these people stay in the public eye. But these records can actually be traced. There are many documented books out on it. And the indications are that the elite expect to liquidate at least 2/3 of the world's populations by the late 90s. And since we, Americans and the Europeans, are harder to keep in line than the Chinese, much of the population thinning will be directed toward the free world and we Americans. And today we can see how the farmers of present times are kept in line through high interest rates and commodity prices that aren't much higher than during the height of the Depression in the 30s. We don't have to tell you who's back of the commodity systems of this world. And as the giant agro-businesses take over the independent farmers, they continue to fall, go bankrupt, and our nation continues to be more controllable and more dependent. And to keep our independent types in line, there's the IRS and the CIA. Well, the IRS acted to garnish or withhold wages after the elite saw too many World War II plant workers evading taxes. Taxes were only a temporary measure at first, but were found very useful to keep the mass of people or workers more docile and controllable. And the more dangerous self-employed entrepreneurs were kept constant and content through various loopholes and preferred treatment. And typically, most of the tax checks went directly to the bankers and the elite through the Federal Reserve banks, and much of it went from there to the Bank of England and the elite's coffers. And when protesters get troublesome, the CIA acts as a police force against the offenders. And the British intelligence programs show that violence is frequently good as an example, and the elite making good use of this. And the tax protesters, especially if they're farmers like Gordon Kahl, being incinerated. This was a good example. A good example to keep patriots in line. And the CIA has a huge amount of cash to work with from its ties with the elite and its drug transactions all across the globe. And what's truly scary is that such organizations and people want to now contaminate other worlds in space beyond our Earth with such vile systems. As Germany was stripped after World War II, 2/3 of its heavy industrial equipment was shipped to Russia. And this was to build up communism and to provide the elite with their useful bad guys and cheap labor, as we pointed out before. And what's ironic is today's relentless hounding of the Germans and the concentration camps was the fact that thousands of German scientists wound up in Russia and wound up working for Allied teams. And even the civilians were hauled over all of Europe. to act as virtual slaves for the rest of Europe. And Hitler had given the world incredible new technology by stepping outside the usual restrictions of the elite. And Germans have been punished ever since for their role with Hitler. Instead of getting shelved as a threat to profit, the new technology that Hitler scientists developed was welcome in Hitler's Germany of that time. And it's little wonder that the dangerous Hitler and his little empire had to be liquidated by the powers who rule this planet. Well, as the space budgets grew, the public had to be conned into supporting the super expensive space programs. I might add that Eisenhower purposely turned down America's first satellite project in order to allow the Sputnik victory of Russia. And this allowed the space race hysteria, which helped to support the needed tax increases at the time. And Nixon, of course, followed orders and allowed billions of dollars worth of equipment and high-tech data to flow to Russia as legal commodities. And the public, of course, was given an entirely different view by the press. Later administrations built up Red China's technology through thousands of intricate, complex, brilliant little schemes. And occasional congressmen who protested were bought off or threatened or even liquidated. One example of this was Larry McDonald, who was a vocal anti-trade congressman at the time, who was blown out of the sky in the infamous Flight 007 over what was once northern Japan, or the part of Japan our leaders gave away to the Russians. Touch a note here on socialism, and we'll point out that the elite know that Americans are never going to adopt socialism by choice. So what they've done is to circumvent this bloc. And they've been calling socialistic programs liberal or anti-socialist, and then they just go ahead with them. Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Nixon, and later presidents all claimed to be conservative. But they went ahead with giveaway programs, socialized medicine, disarmament, civil rights, aid to education, and trade with their enemies anyway. These were directions advocated by the Communist Party as well as the Republicans and Democrats. Well, it was easy as U.S. wages fell through inflation. The world elite fosters socialism because it erodes away individual liberty and it fits into their plan of a one-world system. A few politicians buck the elite's power.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
was Senator Barry Goldwater, and in his book With No Apologies, he said the trilateralists wish to create a worldwide economic power superior to the governments, and they could then rule the world. He said they wanted political, monetary, and intellectual and ecclesiastical control. And the Trilateral Commission was the brainchild of the elites. Brezhnev, in his book Between Two Ages, tells us that Americans will eventually get a new monetary system and a much lower standard of living. And when given the choice between a dictatorship and social disorder, he felt we Americans would choose an authoritarian form of government. Well, every goal of the trilateralists and elite has been toward more control and less freedom as we view the recent history of our planet. The Shah of Iran was an example of a leader who was taken out when he wanted to lift up his people into a strong, self-reliant middle class. He took Iran from a feudal, agricultural society to a strong, self-sustaining, modern nation, and then he was deposed. They all went into the elite's banks in New York. And today, we can see what's happening in the Mideast. Strangely enough, the Khomeini who replaced the Shah was not even the original Khomeini. According to the LA Examiner of June 11th, 1979, the original Khomeini had a finger digit missing, and the new puppet ruler had all his fingers. Something to think about. Well, what our leaders are really like is a moot question. Reagan, for instance, before his election said we had an elitist government run by the elite because they feel the people can't run their own lives. And later, after his election, he filled his administration posts with 64 CFR members and numerous other ties with the elite. Martin Luther King was backed by communist organization and was financed to divide Americans and bring unrest and strife. And communists were told to support, promote, and finance him. And such records were ignored today, of course. We have a Martin Luther King Day equal to George Washington Day. And Cesar Chavez, a labor organizer, had a similar background, was given at least $10 million to gain control of the nation's food supply. Well, some of his aides broke away from he and his communist links to expose him, and such publicity halted his progress. And Nixon was backed by a huge amount of money after Congressman Jerry Voorhis became popular. Voorhis wanted to repeal the Federal Reserve Act and was a champion of freedom. And as Eisenhower later got into the presidency over anti-communist Taft, Nixon got rewarded for his loyalty through the vice presidency. And once in office, Nixon was later framed by the bankers, and their temporary stand-in Ford was used until a stronger replacement was chosen. Kennedy was liquidated because the bankers didn't have quite enough control over him. Later, Johnson was tied directly to them through the First City Bank of Texas, which is a Rothschild bank. And we know the results of all that. And Carter was simply useful as a pawn, since he'd been turned into a yes man and puppet by Admiral Rickover's training programs or brainwashing techniques that are standard for officers. Well, the giveaway of the Panama Canal was against the wishes of the vast majority of Americans, you remember. And the reasons were simple, however. The international bankers lent to Rios millions in the late 60s, and the debt amounted to the billions by the late 70s. Bankers saw no other way to get their money back than to get a hold of the shipping fees from the canal and get the U.S. taxpayers to bolster up the economy of Panama. And things went just as planned, you remember. New agencies like OSHA were designed to break down constitutional freedoms. OSHA dictates broke at least 3 amendments of our Constitution. And things were getting pretty well out of hand until an Idaho businessman took OSHA to the Supreme Court. And they could enter a business without a court order. It was decided that it was unconstitutional. And OSHA has now lost its fangs due to the efforts of this one businessman. And the moral of the story, of course, is that it shows what one individual can do under what's left of our Constitution. And other freedom fighters with knowledge of what's going on have been less successful in most instances, but there are many victories. To mention a few of the less successful freedom fighters, we might mention Rudolf Hess, who just died this year in 1987. He rotted in prison all his life because he knew about the Federal Reserve bankers of New York that financed Hitler and information such as this. And Ezra Pound was a noted another writer at the time of World War II, who was kept in a mental institution until 1950 to keep his mouth shut about how FDR got us into the war and how the bankers really ruled the world. There are dozens of lesser knowns that were liquidated for the same reasons. It's probably well at this point to mention something about population control measures. The constant negative press about coming social and environmental disasters. This was encouraged through the elite's media machinery, and this was to help the public accept further control of our environment by the government. Well, the fact of the matter was that the 4 billion people of the world could all be put in the state of Oregon on plots the size of a residential lot. With unsquelched technology, food would be no problem at all on this planet. For example, India's population is far lower today than in the past. The only thing preventing her progress is the socialistic government control there. Japan, you'll note, has a much denser population and is getting along just fine in this world. Well, most population explosion and food scarcity scenarios are simply rubbish that are invented by the elite's media. And the deeper motives come from the fact that the third world's populations don't contribute as much to the elite's profits, and they're considered more expendable. Wars were used in the past to cut down populations and bring up profits through war machinery and technology sales. It's very simple. Might mention as a side note that in the mid-70s a very useful new virus was probably developed to cut down on the population of non-producers. AIDS was wonderfully efficient at this. And resistance to AIDS broke down through contaminations in the diet. Evidently, too much sex and too much distorted sex could break down this immunity, but the immunity could be built up through immunity-building therapies like oxygen, colostrum, many other unknown methods of the medical profession. Homosexuals usually have dozens of sexual encounters a week, you might recall, and this brings on problems. Well, not all the third worlders are liquidated, of course. During the 60s and 70s, vast sums were drained away from progressive nations and funneled into the third world nations. And this tended to bring more equitable distribution of the world's resources and decrease the power of nations like the United States. The United Nations was a useful tool toward the elite's new one-world systems, you might remember. Let's mention a few things about the one-world goals of the elite. Now, we Americans are often appalled our fellow humans could support communism and the one-world order aims of the elite. Yet this lure is simple, as we tried to show you before. The world is simply filling up with too many persons who are dangerous and have very little self-control over themselves and their actions. The more brilliant elite and world rulers feel that the only real hope for a stable, fruitful world is a one-world system under a benevolent leadership. And if the means to the end gets bloody and nasty, so what? The goal is a world state with imposed peace and prosperity. And breaking down loyalties to religion and state and family ranks high on the elite's list. And it's easy to see how most federally funded organizations fit into this category. And Americans and other wealthy nations are difficult to influence because of our wealth and power. Yet we're easily corrupted through money, power. It was after World War II that it was decided that we had to be stripped of our wealth. They had to bring up the rest of the world. And the goal was a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources. Never mind that many races and peoples didn't deserve their rewards through initiative and brain power. The name of the game was to temporarily handicap and drain the people who did produce and to reward the non-producers. But as the late 80s came, Americans hardly recognized that they'd been stripped of much of their power and strength. We'd willingly worked like slaves to make payments on goods and property that many of us never owned. And we followed the course that our taskmasters laid out with a little complaint about it. The terrifying majority of our population lived with most of their emotions destroyed and in a fantasy world, a world of facades and propaganda. Now, let us look at some recent war history in greater detail. Like most wars, World War II was largely brought on by profit motives. Lives are expendable for profits. And what we're not told in the history books is that during World War I, Germany had been drained of assets, and the country was pretty much in the hands of the Jewish bankers and church factions. And by the time that Hitler came on the scene, Hitler seemed to have genuinely wanted Germany back in the hands of the German people when he first climbed into power. And then, with rather ruthless methods, he clawed his way to a position where he could actually make good on his political promises. And
that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
notables that have ever come through so quickly and so thoroughly. And the international bankers backed Hitler at first. They loaned millions to Germany to set up cartels like IG Farben. And they insisted on agreements that would let Standard Oil supply the oil and IG Farben supply the chemicals. And as Hitler grew independent, the bankers backed out of their support, and Farben supplied Germany's gasoline through processing coal and making their synthetic fuels. And to this day, synthetic fuel processes are stifled by the banking elite to remain in control of the world's power and fuels. Later, the bankers tried to gain greater control of America through the Depression and control of President Hoover in the early 30s. Well, Hoover was having none of what he called their totalitarian liberal controls, and he tried to fight their socialistic legislation. And as a result, the media smeared him as a supporter of big business and being against the little guy. Well, this was exactly opposite of the facts, and the bankers had little trouble getting their man Roosevelt in office. Roosevelt quickly brought in the programs that Hoover considered a part of the corporate state of fascism, even got the credit for many of Hoover's economic reforms. At one point, the bankers actually started plans to overthrow the government and use Roosevelt as their puppet leader. There's a book called The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer that covers this in great detail. Well, as this plan was squelched, it was decided that war would allow restrictive controls to shackle Americans faster, and so plans for war were made. Over and over, and until Roosevelt got what he wanted at Pearl Harbor. There are at least a dozen documented cases that have shown Roosevelt knew the Japanese were coming for Pearl Harbor days and even weeks before this event occurred. Meanwhile, our auto manufacturers, Standard Oil, the DuPonts, and others were making great profits in the Germany of the 30s. And later, the directors of these corporations and cartels escaped the war criminal charges, even though they made the same decisions as the convicted Germans. And as Germany invaded Austria and Poland with U.S.-made tanks running on Standard Oil's gasoline, Hitler became a little too independent for the bankers. He became a little dangerous, and they decided to liquidate him. They were certain they had to liquidate him when they found out that his scientists were about to work out a method to release neutrons. Realizing that a super bomb could give Hitler awesome power, they decided to get the U.S. involved in a war and to fund the first super bomb themselves through war economy taxation. Well, Chamberlain and Churchill, who were once at odds with each other, suddenly began supporting each other, and Hitler became the bad guy of history, and we never hear the end of Hitler. Well, Roosevelt preached peace outwardly, and inwardly he carried out the orders of the elite who put him into office. He appointed CFR member Marshall to keep MacArthur and other independent officers in check, and he plotted to get the Japanese to attack and burst the anti-war sentiments of the American public. Well, the tripartite treaty would automatically drag in Germany to any war with Japan, and so the plans were complete. And we might add that during this time, German U-boats were avoiding American vessels, yet they were getting shot out of the water themselves if American vessels found them exposed. Well, as Hitler attacked Russia, Roosevelt began to supply enormous amounts of war material at our taxpayers' expense. This land lease loans, of course, never did get paid back. And one of the bankers' objectives in World War II was to expand imperialism. Well, as Hitler attacked Russia, Roosevelt began to supply enormous amounts war material, as we mentioned. And General Patton saw what was going on. And Naval Attaché George Earle and several other notables along with Patton tried to prevent this expansion of Russia into Europe, and they all got in trouble. And General Patton was liquidated in a hospital after a planned automobile accident, especially for him. Most military people are quick to admit that Patton was one of the true heroes of World War II. Near the war's end, Roosevelt gave Stalin virtually everything he wanted at Yalta. And patriotic Americans who could see past the propaganda were simply amazed at such a blatant sellout to the communists. Aside from European countries, Russia was given many ports that had belonged to our ally China. Never had there been such a large sellout of the American people. And one of the most disgraceful actions of the elite was the repatriation of some 6 million persons who had helped fight against our enemies during the war. Well, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Churchill carried out this infamous Operation Keelhaul. What happened was hundreds of thousands of Cossacks and other Soviet soldiers were executed and tortured after being turned back to the Soviets after the war. And as the Russians took over Germany, they brutally plundered and raped the German women with the support of our Allied leaders, who called the Germans barbaric. Well, 16 million Germans got moved from Central and Eastern Europe for no good reason after the war, and countless women were used and abused, and hundreds of thousands of men were shipped off to work as slave laborers all across Europe. And there were 2 million persons that actually died during this period of migration. None of this is mentioned in any of the official history books that you will read. We and our children are still taught the official state version of the war, which of course is carefully censored and distorted, and our people are still too busy at working to keep their heads under a roof and their mouths fed to look into the truth. And we still love to see the bad guys get bombed and taught their lesson. Fantasy. Well, the international bankers, or elite as we call them, made millions in war profits and set up communism over much of the world through World War II. We have very little to be proud of. Well, objective Americans can easily see that the only real victor in World War II was communism, and we good guys actually probably helped enslave far more people than we liberated. Not by our bad intentions, mind you, simply because we were just used. We had no business going into World War II or allowing Roosevelt or the bankers to get us in World War II. Well, as the OSS intelligence organization was supposed to be disbanded after the war, it was a simple matter for the elite to simply rename the organization the CIA and use it as their own private police force, with no one the wiser. Well, a friend of mine, an intelligence officer, A.B. Glazier, who was under General Clay at the wartime, exposed this shell game later. He exposed the Central Intelligence Agency for what they were, just unauthorized, illegal scoundrels. And he almost got assassinated for his trouble. and this is a longer tale. Other patriotic notables who did speak out and got bumped off are easy to find as the bad guys and mentally unbalanced. People that are in the history books. The procedures are only a little bit more sophisticated than during the old Inquisition periods. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal saw that our brilliant government leaders were selling us out on purpose, and he started detailed diaries. Well, he was later taken to a naval hospital. Forrestal supposedly committed suicide by jumping from a third-story window with his bathrobe cord knotted around his neck. And the diaries, of course, mysteriously disappeared. And Supreme Court Justice Frank Murphy started mentioning that the communist-controlled Roosevelt also died mysteriously in a Detroit hospital. Later, Senator Joseph McCarthy began exposing communist infiltration and told Americans that the Korean War was planned at Yalta, and he died in the same hospital as Forrestal by what many believed to be a convenient dose of carbon tetrachloride, which simulated hepatitis. Well, dozens of lesser-known individuals were silenced through being locked up or liquidated after exposing much of the true picture. And Truman was a gutsy little guy, but he was apparently easily manipulated while he was in office. He occasionally had pretty pithy views on politicians, though. He said, for example, that Eisenhower was nothing but a damn coward. Nixon was a shifty-eyed goddamn liar, and he really didn't realize how much he himself had been used while he was in office. Well, as Korea was split up between a communist North and a neutral South at Yalta and Potsdam, made an ideal situation for a later lucrative war. The Chinese Communist volunteers are celebrating. They consider a victory here. True history of Korea is very simple, of course. We deliberately held back defense money slated for South Korea, and we later allowed the United Nations and the communists to suck us in to a police action. Americans, of course, were sick and tired of war, but the elite simply started their war under another name as these police actions that we grew accustomed to later. We had a few good men like General MacArthur, who was furious because every time he tried to win this war, his secret plans were either leaked to the enemy or he was halted in his tracks. A Secretary of State Marshal or other front men for the bankers. And eventually, of course, MacArthur began to act on his own, and he got relieved of his command by Truman. His replacement, of course, was a more tractile member of the Council on Foreign Relations, General Ridgway.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
namely, the condition we Americans to accept more control from their organization, the United Nations, and allow us to accept defeat and humiliation. The bankers' objective were also to allow Red China to keep control of its fast-rebelling people. You may recall that millions of dissidents were liquidated by Mao's new regime. And all the while, of course, huge profits were made for the elite and their one-world goals. As we continually pointed out, the elite have always been clever enough to construct enough bad guys to draw public support for their lucrative wars and money giveaway plans. The taxpayers have been continually drained in the more recent years through the fight against communism, and the communists, we know, are drained, taxed, and worked to death to fight us. And that's kind of ironic, since we're both being manipulated. And you'd think that at least one side would catch on sooner or later, but we don't seem to. In the regime of President Wilson, the banker's first recent lackey president, the West has deliberately built up Russia's factories, one at a time, until we've spent billions on Russia now. Using the superweapons technology as a dreaded threat to the free world, the bad guys and good guys game could not only bring in vast profits, could lead to a breakdown in the freedoms of the West. We can see what's happening. For decades now, our corrupt and bought-out leaders have supplied Russia with everything she needed to keep this old tug-of-war game going. Arm and Hammer and Cyrus Eaton and other elitists regularly visited the Soviets and made secret deals that should have gotten them hung as traitors under more normal circumstances with more freedom available. And hundreds of American firms constructed the factories in Russia in the 20s and 30s, and their steel and oil plants in Russia are still thought to bring in huge profits that the international elite never pay U.S. taxes on. And Lend-Lease giveaways after World War II built up Russia into a great power, and the industrial population of slave or cheap labor to get their profits there at an optimum level. Well, with their sights on a one-world system for all of Earth's inhabitants, communism was the perfect foil and the forerunner and blueprint of things to come. And now that we've looked at some of the outward manifestations of the elite for profits, let's take a look at who they are. And this man you should recognize. Former leader of Israel, Begin. And Begin, of course, is a Jew. And this brings us to the most controversial subject of all, the Jews. And just what part the Jews play in the world of the elite rulers is foggy at best. Dozens of conspiracy researchers disagree, and generally speaking, there's a number of different levels of Jews. The highest ranking power yielders based in Britain are often Jewish, yet they continually use their own race to do their dirty work as scapegoats. And this is Edgar Bronfman, the Seagram Whiskey Empire, one of the richest Jews in the world, is a good example. And when the Romanov family of Russia tried to draft the Jewish merchants in pre-communist Russia, it infuriated them. They were used to being privileged, and as a result, they worked together, and the czars fell. And as Lord Rothschild set up his enormous empire based in Britain, he was closely tied in with Rhodes and the other powers behind the crown. And here you see some of the sons of the British leaders who ran Britain a few years ago. the elite make use of Jewish bankers all across the globe to ensure their long-range plans are kept moving with strength. And in return for their loyalty, they're given protection by British and American military and political aid. Well, in the United States, much of the media, the nation's wealth is in the hands of elite Jewish factions. Yet most of these Jews are subject to even higher powers and influences. The Jewish controls and lobbies over our government and politicians is awesome. And it helps Israel get 25% of our whole foreign aid budget. That's over $2 billion a year. And by the 80s, at least, there were $1,000 a day going for every man, woman, and child in Israel. And half of Israel's budget came from aid and gifts from various countries like the United States, which, of course, Israel hadn't earned. And, of course, this in anybody's book makes Israel a parasitic nation. Goodness knows why the Arabs are upset. Well, as I pointed out earlier, the answer is simple on why all this is occurring, because certain races, like the Jews, have a greater DNA strength in their priority component lineage. Moses set up strict laws to assure that his advantage was not lost through sloppy interbreeding in this race. Think about it a minute. The Jews may advocate racial mixing for other races, but they just don't do it themselves. And the result is obvious. The Jewish race can manipulate and use domination tactics better than almost any other race. Oh, I know there be ivory tower theorists who disagree with all this. But these ivory tower theorists who got everything handed to them and learned all they know from books may disagree with anything that's not in the books. And all you need to do is research a little on your own. You'll have your proof. And I may sound like a racist, but I live near Palm Springs, California, the watering hole for many of the elite in America, and I'm simply telling you the facts as I know them firsthand. And generally speaking, Jewish people can be very delightful and affectionate until a business deal comes along, and then outsiders, or goy, as we're called, are fair game. And to be fair about it, of course, the same thing is true to a slightly lesser extent with some Europeans and some Asians and some other Americans. Well, the point is that the DNA patterns that create the manipulative part of the world and the mind is not particularly in the race. It's in certain segments of the race and in individuals. And the Jews, unfortunately, have had a long history of fanning up sympathy to gain advantage. And the German Holocaust issue is a very good example of this. And for its support of Israel, Germany has paid billions. And the Jews never give up, just hounding Germany with its Holocaust con game. Any persons with strong anti-Jew opinions is automatically anti-Semitic, and they're dealt with very severely. An example is the Institute for Historical Review that published books that proved that the 6 million genocide legend was blown way out of proportion, And what happened? Well, the IHR offices were burned up later. Facts you never hear are quite simple. Much of the truth is scattered in newspapers of the period, and eyewitnesses were fast dying off. What happened was the Jews boycotted Hitler, and they declared war on Germany as early as 1933. And what you see before you is a 1933 newspaper that proves this fact. Well, little wonder that Hitler favored using rebel Jews in his factories to turn out war materials. And here you see an aerial view of Auschwitz, which was simply another factory facility to hold the workers. By the time Allies had bombed most of Germany to rubble, food was short, and camp inmates and workers were dying of typhus and malnutrition at all-time high levels. And this wasn't a purposeful extermination campaign. It was the result of war hardships. Many Germans were starving on the outside also. And there are many first-hand accounts and records that are available to set the record straight. The Jewish-controlled media, which is about 99% of the media in the United States, simply won't tell the truth to Americans because it isn't profitable for the bankers. And here's a Frenchman that was at Buchenwald, and he tells us the gas chambers were nonsense. And there are dozens of first-hand accounts of persons that were there that refute many of the accounts of those that claim they were there and are often too young to have even been at that area at that time in age. Well, what we have in Israel today are the more unethical and lower-class Jew leaders who were kicked out of Europe by the more ethical Jews there who ran much of Europe in post-World War II era. Begin, the former terrorist who headed Israel for years, was typical of this breed of Jew. And an intelligence officer friend of mine dealt with both factions and got the boat that took them all to Israel. And their leaders asked them to leave because they couldn't be trusted, wouldn't work with the other black marketeers of Europe. And the Jews who control much of the world's banking don't really work too closely with these Israeli Jews. And in the United States, the Jews control the investment banks, which make 5 times the amount on loans over regular commercial banks. And Roosevelt was the one that handed this to the Jews through his Stiegel bill. This was just after he gained office. And incidentally, Roosevelt himself was part Jew. And all this, of course, brings us around to the Arabs, or the neighbors of the Jews in Israel, and why they have reason to resent them. Well, this is because of their land grab. Israel.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge.
And this was the Arabs' major water source. And there are 1 million Arabs that are now enslaved on the West Bank. Many Arab nations simply have too many billions in Jewish and New York banks, though, to turn on their bankers, the people who use them. There are only Gaddafi of Libya and Iran that really put their heart into fighting the West through various subversion and terrorism. And we can see their reasons if we look back in history, because their countries were looted by the elite bankers. And they consider we Westerners corrupt and unethical, or at least our leaders. And while Gaddafi may be rather ruthless, he does feel that he has a good motive for his actions. And little wonder that the Arabs are not all ruthlessly attacking the West, because actually the bankers used the oil-rich Arabs in a clever scheme in recent years to grab much of the world's mineral wealth. They got the price of oil tripled in 1973 on the condition that the Arabs deposit most of the money in their New York banks for 30 years. Well, the Arabs at the time weren't too sophisticated, and they were led down the garden path. And what happened was that the bankers loaned this money that they'd received from the Arabs out to the third world nations through separate fronts. So if the payments were defaulted and the money disappeared, the bankers would get off scot-free. And the elite got most third worlders who borrowed this money way in debt over their heads. And this gave them the opportunity to forgive the debts of the countries who were indebted if they would just sign away all of their mineral and oil rights. Well, many countries took the bait, and the rulers, though, like Marcos of the Philippines, who didn't, got deposed pretty quickly. Might add that the Mohammedans who follow Muhammad, shown here, do not have interest. They consider it usury. And of course, Moses and the early Christians taught that usury was wrong, and today, of course, we Christians are being used by the elite and their banking systems that brought in usury. Something to think about. And because of the bankers' action and what has taken place recently, in these 80s, as they come up, it appears the Arabs may suddenly start dumping their stocks and paper wealth on us at any time. And when the world finds that 90% of the Arabs' wealth has been squandered by the bankers who were supposed to be storing their money, when these bankers get tired of the bank's hold on them, well, we'll have big problems. And the Arab leaders will have to leave Arabia and the countries of the Mideast, and the people there will probably go back to being nomads like they were before for a short time. Unless the bankers come in, and of course the bankers will promise to save the day. And I'm sure the picture will be very easy to see. The bankers or elite will then come along with their new cashless exchange systems. They'll financially enslave the entire Western world if they get their way. And for a time then, the elite and their systems will probably rule the world with a heavy hand. And the third world people and dissenting freedom fighters will be exterminated by the millions. Well, now that you have a quick rundown on recent history and the factions that run the world behind the scenes, let's go one step further and try to plot our future. Well, thousands of prophecies have told of a coming tribulation when the world's population would be in great trouble. The great teachers explained that the end time was a time of choice, a time when we could either choose to follow the golden rule and the choice laws of the Creator, or to follow the dominion laws and try to exploit and use our neighbors and bail out of the whole situation. In a sense, then, our souls have needed all the chaotic experiences here on this earth to make a valid choice. And if we use and abuse others, our souls places us in a position where we can use and be abused. We learn this way. And these retribution laws, or laws of karma, as the ancients called them. And eventually some of us learn the error of dominion and domination tactics. And the people on this planet who carry the ancient souls of the ancient rulers are especially tempted and especially dangerous. And you see them at work today. And you see how very little has really changed on our planet. Outwardly, we may have the technology, but inwardly, we're still too often savages. And this lack of change and lack of ethics by the majority assures us of having more troubled times ahead. And in other presentations, I cover how humans can escape this through a mental balance action. I also have an expose of the upcoming polar shift or flood, which will probably foil the plans of the elite to bring... Well, as we've traveled through a little history, we've seen again how we're all influenced by the outward domination patterns of this world. Now let's go to a little deeper into what's in back of these events and all this chaos. Now, we've seen that there's a spiritual war going on in one sense. The forces of reflection or domination are trying to set up a one-world system under the benevolent control of a few. And the forces of free choice and the so-called real are trying to hold the planet together while our souls learn the errors of dominion. And had there been no intelligences of choice with a great deal of power, our species would have destroyed ourselves many years ago. And an example of this over-control, as I call it, is in the 6-day wars of Israel. Remember, she was heading to Cairo with nuclear warheads when the entire army suddenly came to a halt for no known reason, just 60 miles from Cairo. And Golda Meir, the head of Israel, as you may remember, had so much mental trauma shortly after that she resigned. And to this day, military people are baffled as to what could cause this unexplainable phenomenon. Well, many times accidents have occurred that would have led to a nuclear holocaust if an overseeing hand had not interfered. Many times buttons have been pushed without success on this planet. Well, the strange truth is, we humans are allowed to destroy ourselves, but we're not allowed to endanger the planet. And to think our Creator would allow us to destroy our planet is arrogant imbecility. We're only given so much rope, and many times the domination leaders are themselves pawns in the game. Because somewhere in other dimensions and other worlds, there are people there are identities and intelligences beyond ours who do care what happens to our planet. Well, that sounds like an interesting scenario, you might think, but think about it. MacArthur was going to use nuclear weapons to end the war in Korea, and Nixon himself was getting ready to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, and both were stopped by actions of the elite or money changers, who were probably pawns in this little game. To be sure, the motives were probably monetary for the elite, but they were humanitarian for the overseeing free forces. And Nixon, as we pointed out, was removed, and he was framed by the elite who put him in office. And he saw communist missile silos being placed over Vietnam, and he started to get ready to flatten many major areas of the country to end the conflict. And a month later, he was in deep trouble over a minor incident that was repeated by most of the elite's front men regularly in Washington. And this is pointed out to show you the layers in truth and in reality in this world. Well, from a higher level of observation, we are all in a cosmic classroom gaining experience. And to take things at face value in this world is very foolish, because things are never what they appear to be in this material world of illusion here. When you see a Nixon being hung on the cross as a bad guy, you can almost believe that somewhere in there he's been a good guy to deserve his punishment here. And the forces of evil or elite may run our planet from a superficial perspective, but choice laws and the forces of free choice ride at the master controls here. And since the time of the genetic alteration of our species, which we mentioned before, there has been a major group of volunteers who oversee our worldly affairs. They carefully monitor us in spacecraft that are awesome in size and ability. And in other productions, I go into more detail on this subject. Suffice to say here, hundreds of thousands of sightings of alien craft superior to ours should brighten this point a little. Well, according to avatars with knowledge in such areas, there are at least 3 million humans on our planet at any one time with what we could call an alien component in them. And while ordinary humans have a soul and several mind components, these star children, as they're sometimes called, have a non-material component of intelligence that directs their actions under special circumstances. And after years of staying in the usual human-like channels, some star children suddenly wake up to some mission in regard to uplifting humanity. And a person may be in public office and then suddenly strike out against the dominion system and actions of their superiors. And far from being mystical gurus on some mountaintop, they may be just led to write science fiction that shows the choice, domination situation in a more youth-oriented way than the Bible does. Such persons often have a hard time surviving and fighting against a system with opposite goals to theirs. As peace marchers or reform advocates, they'll be a tiny minority, and they'll often serve as examples and martyrs for the mass.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
working toward a better world have only to find the goals of the group to recognize their allegiance. And any goals that stray from self-choice and demand a leader is of domination. You can bet your boots on it. Probably 95% of the mystery schools and political and occult organizations and churches and other groups are usually filled with the contamination of dominion and domination principles. Think about it. The golden rule or free choice principles are used by the tiny minority working toward a leaderless paradise on Earth. And until we humans begin to rule ourselves, we're going to be ruled over by the domination factions and the elite, as we call them. And because the media is in the hands of the elite for the most part, the truth is often exactly opposite from what we're told by the media. And over again, we've tried to show you examples of this. And our favorite example is good old Nixon. Another example is bad guy Senator Joe McCarthy. And like Nixon, he actually was a good guy. Before he was murdered, McCarthy accused our nation's leaders of conspiracy on a large scale. And after his death, the communists intimated, and they were very pleased by it all. And they intimidated the less strong patriots for many years after that. And McCarthy may have been a very crude and blunt person, but the fact remains he didn't deserve the roasting he got from the media or his assistants, or the bad name he still has. And as we mentioned before, Hoover was deliberately roasted by the press to allow the elites man FDR to gain control. And FDR, of course, got us in a war to help the elites' long-range plans. A typical bad guy. Many of the people still love him. And today the good guys like Martin Luther King are notable, but were complete scoundrels. And Ike was a favorite with the press, yet he sold out Americans over and over, and the only one time in his whole career that he stood out alone and wanted to do something for the American people, they sent him to a hospital, and he walked out much more like a zombie than if he were sick and going in. It's a detail that we can't cover here for lack of time. We know it's very dangerous to go outside the majority. And there are over 1,500 Council on Foreign Relations members. And most of the nation's newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV networks are controlled by these members. And they also control the major foundations who find socialistic causes and influence most of the academic world. And the CIA, as we keep pointing out, simply acts as their own private police force. Many of these people are on the Trilateral Commission, which is geared to hasten a one-world money system, and bleed Americans' financial strength, and keep a communism strong. And Heinz Kissinger, Henry Kissinger as he's known now, was one of the most active frontmen for the elite in the 80s, and he repeatedly made deals for his masters after his Harvard indoctrination. He double-crossed Israel and sold us on the petroleum panic of 1973 as his first major assignment. He was a black marketeer after the war. Great fellow. Much suppressed history and details of past years was in the Gemstone file. And if you recall, Larry Flint, or Hustler magazine's editor and publisher, was promptly shot for his trouble in printing the Gemstone file. Well, Yale loves to turn out traitors like Averell Harriman, Stinson, George Bush, and George Bundy. And you remember Bundy admitted our university study programs are directed by CIA and outside influences. Yale's secret orders and brotherhoods not only influence education, but manipulate wars and population reduction schemes as well. And details on all this are available from several publications covering conspiracies. It's interesting to note that among the elite are a few individuals who follow the secret occult practices that give their movement energy and power. Typical are a couple of dozen space flights, putting the Star Wars programs in place. 7 astronauts were sacrificed on purpose in this program. Star Wars, I might point out, is mostly concerned with processing banking data on individuals in the upcoming moneyless system to be introduced. Only about 40% of the system has anything to do with defense. The elite are intertwined with organizations like the Masons and Golden Dawn, and every president of the United States ever had except Lincoln was a Freemason. Albert Pike, the man who wrote the Mason's Scottish Rite, stated that Lucifer was the god of Freemasonry. Something to think about. Of course, most persons in Freemasonry are not aware of all of this. It's obvious that very few lower degree Masons have any idea of what Masonry's higher goals are. From a very ancient mystery school, it's possible that Masonry was infiltrated and distorted from its original principles. The Illuminati is a powerful world force that was started by a Jesuit priest on May 1st, 1776. And you might remember that communists and many of the elite, like the upper crust celebrities, worldwide celebrate this date. Kings, popes, and rulers have tried to drive the Jesuits from their domains, knowing what they were up to, but the Jesuits remain powerful beyond the recognition of most conspiracy researchers. They are felt to be responsible for altering Freemasonry principles and starting the French Revolution and many other projects. And as this presentation is done in the mid-80s, the superpowers are in a crisis stage in the Middle East. The elite want the Mideast oil in their hands, but they realize they can't afford to offend the huge Arab Muslim culture to the point of an all-out war. If Russia can get Iran, Libya, and Ethiopia to side with them, they'll wipe out Israel and control the Gulf area. And this will lead to eventual control of the Cape, the Panama Canal, and such. And strategic metals would then be available only on Russian terms, and freedoms in the world would quickly erode away even further in the years to follow, and we'd all be weeping. You can see how Afghanistan suffered in the mid-80s from simply being between Russia and the Gulf. All of the wealth and control that Russia wanted. And of course now all we need to do is see how well the elite can juggle all the pawns in their game to gain more control without too much damage to all the technology that they have put in place all over this planet of ours. Very interesting future coming up, now that you see some of the wider spectrum of the whole picture here. Well, at this point, let's milked of taxes to pay for armament against the Russian bad guys. Our history books trace it all back to the time of the Tsars. So let's go into a little Russian history here. According to the story, starving Russian peasants rose up against the Tsar because they were being oppressed. Well, with only a little research, this concept is typically a complete reversal of the facts. In truth, the Russians were about to get a new democratic constitution after a few decades of rapid economic growth. The Tsars were about to relinquish much of their control, and the middle class was enjoying rapid progress. What happened, in truth, was that the Russians' newly discovered Baku oil fields proved a possible threat to the international oil monopoly of the Rockefellers, their Standard Oil empire. Old John D. Rockefeller grabbed 95% of the America's oil sales, and he wanted the Russian oil that Rothschilds and Nobel controlled in Russia. Vast amount of oil over there. Well, New York industrialists started loaning money to various revolutionary groups to harass Russia. The Tsar exiled Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, and began to set up a democratic republic after curbing these first attacks by the rebels. He then deposited millions in various banks of the Rothschilds, and Rockefellers, presumed by, wanted to buy toleration from them. The Tsar felt he could set this money in, they'd tax against him, and this was futile, of course. Well, it was to finance the rebels. The Tsars allowed the Russian people to vote against the communists, and only 30% of the Russian people wanted the communists. So the Bolsheviks kidnapped the Romanov family, the Tsar, and told the people they'd been killed. It's debatable today whether they had been killed. But this is another story. But anyway, Lenin promptly took over all private property, and the banking elite supported he and the new communist system. Now, British and American leaders managed to hold off several dangers to the new communist regime until they gained sufficient control and power over Russia. The American bankers contributed money to the communist cause. As the remoter Russians began to resist the communists, 3 million of them were starved to death until they submitted. Ukraine, not one paper in the United States of any note ran this story. One little Chicago paper. Well, to eliminate the troublesome middle class, the new government printed huge amounts of worthless paper money to erode the people's savings away. Sound familiar? Well, over 20 million Russians were executed or died in prison camps as a result of the Russian Revolution. Still, the censored media articles and history books tell us that the whole episode was an uprising against a repressive government. What a farce. As the Rockefeller, Rothschild, and others share in Russia's wealth today, we should tremble in fear against what they've planned for us. Well, the elite were delighted at how easily they had captured the Russian nation and made slaves of her people. And they decided that they'd start World War II to allow their Russian empire to expand into Eastern Europe and to pave the way for the one world government, or a United Nations program later. And bad guy Joe McCarthy recognized that our leaders deliberately delayed the invasion of Europe to give Russia time to move into Eastern European areas, and he said so. And when many German leaders wanted to assassinate Hitler and surrender, they were ignored. And when they stipulated that the Soviets were to be halted east of Europe, it infuriated the elite. The elite and their front men like Roosevelt wanted Russia in Europe, and they eliminated any patriots who got in the way. And they threatened to expose these little plans of theirs.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
civilians and hundreds of thousands of soldiers and patriots were turned over to the Russians in payment for aiding we allies. This meant sure death or a life of slavery for their loyalty. And this is how we repaid them. Operation Keelhaul is still infamous among patriotic people who remember the incident. Roosevelt gave the communists vast stocks of materials, new lands that were once owned by our ally China at Yalta. And at the war's end, it was easy to see that the victorious armies had enslaved more people than they'd liberated. The elite had founded their crowning achievement with a huge slave state, Soviet Russia, a power to weaken the West and model their new world on. Well, when we look at the genetic lineage that is ruling Russia today, we find that the Khazar Jews are at the helm. Their Edomite or Red Banner has been the same for centuries. The Red Jews' empires was destroyed in northern Russia, and Europeans found them so materialistic and devious that they banned many of the European areas. Well, the Europeans had their Renaissance once they'd expel these Khazar Jews and their usury. Well, the tide changed later when the Bolshevik Khazar Jews of Eastern Europe overthrew the Russian Tsars. And to cover up their identity, they've staged Jewish demonstrations and given the impression that the Jews in Russia are picked on. And we might add this is a favorite strategy that brings billions to Israel, as we pointed out earlier. Now, Christian historians can trace the biblical prophecies concerning the Edomites and their worship of their old god, earth gods, Baal and such. Well, now that we approach the end of this presentation, I hope you are realizing the nature of what's really going on here on this planet. And if you're serious about exploring more truth, explore with me through other presentations. And being a so-called Christian people, we Americans seldom venture beyond the Bible and worthless history books that are in front of us for our spiritual history. This is a mistake. Truth has always been available to all races in a more veiled form. An example of this is Zoroaster the prophet of Persia. He's an example of an enlightened sage who made truth available to that area of the world. Now, we Christians follow the Bible. The Bible is very limited. The Zoroastrians knew that Ahriman, the evil son of our Creator, was given 9,000 years to rule this world. And they were taught that Ahriman even has another counterfeit heaven beyond this earth that fools people whose soul go into the netherworld after death. And they realized that our souls were given a period of testing, so that if we learn to reject domination and learn balance of our components, remember what Jesus Christ said, know thyself? Well, we could overcome evil and become immortal through this balance. And as usual, threat to our planet and the lives of millions today is not atomic war or any of the usual disasters that we read of in our favorite tabloids. Well, the fast approaching disaster, which can destroy us all, is a simple, natural phenomena of nature that is as cyclic as day and night. And for over 12,000 years now, we humans have been recording these disasters. And as astonishing as it may be, the general public has almost no knowledge of what we call today the cyclic pole shifts, even yet. And these Earth's pole shifts occur when the ice at the South Pole builds up unevenly enough to cause the Earth to wobble far out of its normal orbit. And from the evidence and calculations of many experts, the next pole shift will occur around the year 2000. And when this occurs, gigantic walls of water will careen around our planet, washing away all signs of present civilization. And 200-mile-per-hour winds will virtually flatten most of the trees and flatten the tops of many of our mountain peaks. It's happened before, and it will evidently happen again. These great walls of water will wash over most of our land masses, and our technology and materialistic gains will be swept away and reduced to rubble. And the very few survivors that are left will be living in caves at a Stone Age level, struggling just to stay alive. And for at least 100 years after the axis shift, the weather will remain chaotic. Normal crop growing will be difficult. And the survivors of humanity that are left will be forced to live on any edibles that they can find in nature's stock. Well, if all this is true, why haven't we heard about all these dangers from our official governmental sources, many ask? Well, since 1921, our scientists have been aware that the Earth is wobbling worse each year on its axis. And some government scientists predicted way back then, that time, that the Earth would flip over at what they call the 45 seconds. In the mid-1980s, scientists pointed the doomsday clock hands are now at 4 minutes till doomsday. And since they felt it would only cause unnecessary panic, officialdom has simply felt any benefit would come from telling the public information like this, so they've kept quiet about it. And up to the present, it was felt that there wasn't really much that could be done about the problem anyway. And now we have the various spin-offs of technology from the laser, and so the situation is brighter today. We have a form of weapon called the phaser today that can dematerialize ice, for example, and this can be done from ships or satellites. Using the combined technology of the superpowers, we could work together. We could mutually send enough equipment into space or to the South Pole to disembody the unbalanced ice buildup there. And once we trimmed the offending ice away, our climate could resume its normal levels. Today, we're continuing to have chaotic weather patterns simply because of this increasing polar wobble. And why this affects weather is very simple. In the early 80s, free of the elite and their hidden control. After this time, the church and state never worked together peacefully again. The rulers found that they could rule through their monetary systems if they kept many small factions quarreling and fighting among themselves. And if they could control from behind the scenes without any attention or discovery under such conditions, they could live just like the old gods of legend. And one of the world's great ruling structures today is the Rothschild Group. And they started from a banker named Amschel, who financed King George mercenaries during the war against our first patriots. And today his descendants make up our Federal Reserve System and rule much of our world today.
And that it is time that world governments officially acknowledge
Came for the 1917 Communist Revolution. The Rothschilds wanted the billion-dollar fortunes of the Tsars or the Romanov rulers of Russia. And once this fortune was seized and safely in the Rothschild banks across the world, the more or less ethical Romanov lineage was replaced by the completely unethical black nobility lineage now ruling the world from Europe. The black nobility quickly gained their power by unscrupulous methods all across the globe, and they stripped Germany of her through World War I. Later, Hitler came along and promised to give the depressed and conquered Germany back to the German people. And he actually did this for a short time. But unfortunately, he was double-crossed. The Federal Reserve banking money from New York that helped finance him at first was cut off later. And he was told that England would support his actions, and we know that later, of course, England and the bankers cut him off and turned against him. Well, since the European bankers gained financial control of America through this Federal Reserve System that we have, their puppets like Roosevelt saw to it that the U.S. got involved in the war against Germany also. The bankers wanted Russia and her people strong enough to play against the West. So they saw to it that Russia gained the most from a demolished Germany. Invariably gave up their freedoms, and their end usually came quickly, according to history. Well, the elite rulers work through governments because people easily follow governments, and the governments can usually be manipulated and controlled by the elite. And the founding fathers of the United States did their best to set up a constitution that was invulnerable to the ruling elite. And they knew what a government gave, it could also take away. And they set up the system so that all laws which were unconstitutional were invalid. And today, hundreds of thousands of laws are unconstitutional, but they are not contested and overruled by the indifferent citizens. Well, William Penn wrote that if we weren't governed by God, then we would be governed by tyrants. That's quite a true statement. Virtually all of our founding fathers wanted rights of the individual over the rights of the state. And they were restrictive toward government rights, not the rights of the individual. They also knew that property was important. Governments that could control property could control the individual. And as socialistic governments set up taxation, licenses, and permits and such restrictions quickly eroded away freedoms. And production in socialistic and communistic countries stagnates when private ownership and sales rights are stripped. The tiny private plots of farmers in Russia and China were supplying about half the food in the mid-'80s, even though there was 5 times the land on collective farms of the state. Choice factors have always proven superior to the peoples of the world. Only leaders constantly brainwash and coerce people into domination systems, and it's usually for their own gain and power. And of course this leads to an early death of any system or structure. And to see how all of recent history has been corrupted by domination leaders, let's look at events after the time of the Byzantine Empire in Europe. This huge empire lasted 1,200 years and was the last successful empire to remain. Tapes carrying over this ability to manipulate and control. Such beings take over government and business leadership positions with ease. They have a natural ability at domination and of using others. And since money is the most useful tool toward gaining power, they have no compunction at using others as workers to amass their wealth. And because of their background, few of these ancient exile souls have any of the usual ethics to hinder their material progress here. According to a number of spiritual teachers, there's a problem coming up for them, however. There's a time limit on re-entry into the Creator's choice system. And at the time of the end, which is coming up at the turn of the century, where all humanity must choose their future, according to some of these avatars. And the scenario is quite simple. We humans have had 10,000 years of exposure to both choice and domination systems, and now we must make a choice as to which one we is to live by and to follow. And what happens to persons who make no choice or follow domination is very simple. They simply use the various new mind components that they were contaminated with at the time our species mated with these gods. The meek shall inherit the earth. Well, what do we mean by meek? Well, in simplistic terms, this means a return to animal instinct. The fruit of knowledge will be stripped away again, and the simple life will return once more to earth. Those that wish to carry on in higher knowledges with intelligence can do so under ethical self-control. And those who want to go back to the simple life and escape the responsibilities of self-control can do also. The soul-led being will choose, and the choice will determine the being's status for an eternity, according to some of the avatars. Well, the world's Bibles put all of this in more simplistic, veiled terms, but the basics were there. All Bibles have been filled with the doctrines of choice and ethics, and the doctrines of fear and domination. Either humans feel domination is necessary in the world, or we feel that ethical self-control and free choice are necessary. And we will all make the choice, knowingly or unknowingly. And it is necessary under choice laws of the universe that we make this choice. And in our production of Earth Report, there are further details on this outline. But in our journey through recent history, this background is enough here. It will help to explain, while there are thousands of humans who are trying to bring about socialism and a one-world government. These leaders are often carrying components that drive them from their reflection point of view. A point of view where they feel that they are superior and need to rule over the childish majority here. To them and their leaders, humanity will never have enough self-control and ethics to make a reasonably stable civilization here. They actually feel that their superior intellect and abilities are needed to govern the rest of the world's people. And if their tactics are ruthless, well, so what? The souls will find new bodies later. Nothing's really lost in the long run. But what the advocates of domination seldom notice is that this system is self-destructing. The highest leaders have good intentions, like a paradise on earth as a goal, but their systems just can't seem to handle the construction. Look at history if you doubt this. Thousands of little tyrants come along on their own, and they only want their own kingdoms and power. The higher level domination leaders simply can't control all these little ambitious underlings. Yes, you can look up this erosion principle in history books on your own. A good place to start is Rousseau's monumental Freedom and Domination. This is a classic in the field, and it shows how all governments and systems of the past self-destructed as their choice principles eroded away. Citizens who embraced socialism wanted something for nothing. Our ancestors were living in crude villages with virtually no technology, and suddenly alien technology and systems were introduced by invading gods. It's in the book many, many places. The lazy, sleepy days for Homo sapien were at an end. And as they bred with the alien gods, their brain circuits were evidently changed. Our ancestors no longer dwelled in the Edenic paradise like innocent children. They ate of the fruit of knowledge and had to start making choices and learning to handle the newly introduced technologies and knowledges. And instead of the instinct like the animals had, they had to choose between ethical and non-ethical actions. The problem arose because of the reflection knowledge introduced by the gods according to the Hermetic works. The gods carried the exact opposite systems of intelligence that the Creator had as his system. And instead of choice laws, which allowed all beings of intelligence choice, the gods were exiled to Earth for ignoring choice and starting domination systems here. Traditions and legends tell of an emissary called the Windy One, translated Holy Ghost, who visited the early rebel gods, and he told them to stop their dominion of innocent tribal people or to suffer the consequences. And as the early gods and rulers refused, they lost their immortality and had to be born of babies, like the species that they had been subjugating. This is the legend. With such corrupt souls taking on the bodies of mortals, it should be obvious why such chaos continues on our planet. There are powerful, power-mad entities with superior knowledge of technology and domination tactics taking on human bodies constantly here. And with their inner soul